I run a cozy, family-owned bookstore in a bustling downtown area. During the holidays, the place transforms into a hive of activity, with book lovers flocking in to snag gifts for their loved ones. Last year, the holiday rush left me short-staffed, so I hired 2 temporary employees, a quiet young man named Greg and a bubbly woman named Lucy. Greg was reserved, barely engaging with customers or co-workers, but his work was efficient, so I didn't think much of it. On Christmas Eve, our busiest day, the store was packed. People browsed shelves and queued at the counter, the sound of holiday music mixing with the chatter of excited shoppers. I darted between helping customers and restocking shelves when I noticed we were running low on our most popular gift sets, beautiful leather-bound classics that sold like hotcakes. I headed to the stockroom in the back to grab more. The room was dimly lit, with rows of shelves lined with inventory. As I pushed through the door, I heard muffled voices and the faint clinking of metal. Alarmed, I crept forward, the hairs on my neck prickling. Rounding a corner, I froze. 2 men in dark hoodies were loading boxes of our most valuable inventory into large duffel bags. My stomach sank as I realized what was happening. We were being robbed. One of the men spotted me. "Stay where you are," he barked, stepping closer. I stood rooted to the spot, heart hammering, trying to think of a way to alert the others without drawing attention. Before I could act, the stockroom door creaked open again. Relief surged through me as I saw Greg step inside. He stopped dead, his eyes darting between me and the men. "Greg," I said, my voice shaking, "call the police." But Greg didn't move. Instead, he smirked, an expression I hadn't seen on him before. He walked toward the robbers, exchanging a nod with one of them. My chest tightened as realization dawned. Greg was in on it. "Make her sit," Greg instructed. One of the men grabbed me by the arm and pushed me down onto an overturned crate. I sat, trembling, as they continued loading up their bags. They moved quickly, clearly knowing exactly what to take. Greg kept glancing back at me, his expression cold, detached, so different from the quiet employee I thought I knew. Minutes later, they were ready to leave. They blindfolded me and tied my hands loosely with twine, an act of false security, as if to say they weren't cruel enough to hurt me, but wanted to leave me helpless. I stayed still, listening intently, as I heard them exit through the back door. Moments later, the sound of a van revving up and speeding away echoed into the night. It took me mere seconds to loosen the twine and rip off the blindfold. I sprinted to the store floor, my voice shaking as I shouted for Lucy and the remaining staff to call the police. The authorities arrived quickly, but the robbers and Greg were long gone. As I reviewed the security footage with the officers, my heart sank further. The cameras covering the stockroom had been disabled, likely by Greg. Despite the setback, I was determined to rebuild the store's sense of safety and trust. The theft was devastating, but the betrayal cut deeper. The police opened an investigation, and though I gave them all the information I had about Greg, the trail eventually went cold. The bookstore continues to thrive, but I haven't hired temporary help since. That Christmas Eve taught me a hard lesson. Sometimes the greatest threats come from where you least expect them. It was the busiest night of the year, Thanksgiving evening, when shoppers flooded the mall for Black Friday sales. I was 22 then, working as a part-time associate at a high-end clothing store. The chaos was both exciting and exhausting, and that year, I'd been scheduled for the closing shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. Around 11 p.m., the energy in the store started to wane as customers thinned out. My feet ached, and I could barely focus on folding jeans anymore. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the last hour to go faster. But that's when the man walked in. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing a brown leather jacket and scuffed boots. His eyes darted around the store, scanning racks of discounted clothes as if looking for something specific. I figured he was just another last-minute shopper. "Excuse me," he said, walking up to me with a faint smile. His voice was low and calm, almost soothing. "I'm looking for a gift for my daughter. Could you help me pick something out?" "Of course," I said, putting on my customer service face despite my exhaustion. He asked for recommendations on jackets, and we moved toward the back of the store. The area was quieter, away from the main floor, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy as he trailed closely behind me. Still, I brushed it off. It was Black Friday after all, and customers could be odd under stress. After a few minutes, he picked out a coat. "This is perfect," he said. "Could you help me carry it to my car? My hands are full with other bags." It was an odd request. Most people would just manage or ask for a bag, but I didn't want to be rude. The parking lot was packed, and I figured he was parked nearby. "Sure," I said hesitantly. As we left the store, I noticed the lot was quieter than it had been earlier. Some cars were still parked, but the crowd had mostly moved on. He gestured toward a silver van parked farther out, away from the main rows. My unease grew. "This is it," he said, stopping next to the van. He opened the side door, revealing a cluttered interior. Blankets, boxes, and random tools were scattered about. Something about it made my stomach turn. "Thanks for helping," he said, stepping around to the back of the van. "Could you just place the jacket inside for me? I'll be right there." I leaned in cautiously, placing the coat on one of the seats. As I turned to step back, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart jumped. I spun around, and through the tinted window I saw his face, calm and expressionless. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked around to the driver's seat, got in, and started the engine. Panic surged through me. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked into place. "Let me out!" I yelled, pounding on the window. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his calm demeanor replaced by something darker, more unsettling. "Sit still," he said coldly, "and don't make this harder than it needs to be." I felt around for my phone, only to remember I'd left it in the store locker. My stomach sank. But then I remembered I still had my key fob for the store. It had a small panic button that triggered an alarm system inside. It wasn't much, but it was something. I waited until the van stopped at a red light before I pressed it, praying it would work from this distance. A faint beep echoed from my pocket. The man didn't seem to notice. He kept driving, turning onto a quieter road away from the main streets. Minutes passed. The van stopped again, this time in an empty alley. My pulse raced as he stepped out, circling back toward the side door. "This is where it ends," he said as he slid the door open. But before he could pull me out, bright headlights flooded the alley. A car screeched to a halt behind us, and two men jumped out, security guards from the mall. My panic button had worked, alerting the store, and they'd come looking for me. The man froze, then bolted. One of the guards tackled him to the ground while the other helped me out of the van. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The police arrived moments later. They arrested the man and found out he'd been stalking the mall all evening, looking for vulnerable employees. As for me, I quit that job the next day and never worked retail again. Black Friday might be known for chaos, but for me, it's a reminder of how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare. Black Friday was never really my thing. The endless crowds, the chaos, it was overwhelming. But this year I caved. My parents had been hinting about wanting a fancy outdoor fire pit, and Home Depot was advertising one at half price. It seemed worth braving the early hours and madness. I pulled into the parking lot at 3:45 a.m., the store just 15 minutes from opening. To my surprise, the lot was eerily empty. Only a few cars dotted the spaces. I chalked it up to people prioritizing electronics over outdoor decor. When the doors opened, I grabbed the fire pit quickly, loading the bulky box onto a cart. At checkout, the cashier looked half asleep, barely glancing at me as he rang up the purchase. A stock worker helped me load the box into my car, and by 4:20, I was ready to leave. As I slid into the driver's seat and adjusted my mirrors, a light knock startled me. A man stood outside my window, dressed in a dark coat and beanie, his breath visible in the cold air. "Sorry to bother you," he said, voice soft, almost apologetic. "Could you give me a ride? My car broke down a few blocks from here." I hesitated. It was dark, and I didn't know this guy, but something about his demeanor felt harmless. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. "Sure," I said. "Where do you need to go?" He slid into the passenger seat and shut the door. "Just down the road," he replied vaguely. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced at him briefly. He was quiet, hands resting on his lap, staring straight ahead. The silence felt heavy. I tried to make small talk. "So what were you shopping for?" I asked. "Nothing," he replied. His answer caught me off guard. Why would someone hang around a store on Black Friday if they weren't shopping? I let it go, focusing on the road. Minutes passed. "Where exactly is your car?" I asked. "Keep going," he said. The vague directions were unsettling, but I kept driving. The further we went, the darker the streets became. The glow of streetlights faded, replaced by long stretches of empty road. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You sure it's this way?" I pressed. He didn't respond. My chest tightened as dread crept in. His silence felt oppressive, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every breath. I considered pulling over, telling him I couldn't go any further, but something in his posture, still yet tense, made me reconsider. Finally, up ahead, I saw the faint glow of a gas station. Relief washed over me. "There's a gas station," I said. "You can wait there if you need help." He didn't reply, but as I pulled into the station, he opened the door and stepped out. He stood there for a moment, looking at me through the windshield, his face shadowed by the dim light. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness behind the building. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. I glanced around the car, needing a distraction from the lingering unease. That's when I noticed it. My glove compartment was ajar. I reached over and opened it fully, dread pooling in my stomach. My wallet was gone. Panic set in. My license, credit cards, everything was in there. I whipped my head toward the station, but the man was nowhere in sight. I sped back home, paranoia chasing me every mile. When I arrived, I double-checked the locks on every door and window, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The next morning, I called my bank to cancel my cards and reported the incident to the police. They took a report but admitted there wasn't much they could do. Days passed, and I tried to move on. But late one evening, as I settled into bed, a notification pinged on my phone. It was an alert from my home security app. Someone was at my front door. Heart pounding, I opened the app. The feed was grainy, but I could make out a figure standing on the porch, dressed in a dark coat and beanie. He didn't knock or try the door. He just stood there, staring at the camera. After a moment, he raised his hand and waved. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, he turned and walked away. The police didn't find any signs of forced entry. They said he was probably just trying to scare me. But when I reviewed the footage later, I noticed something chilling. He wasn't just waving, he was holding my wallet.